Okay, good morning, good afternoon, possibly good evening to some of you. I'm Christina Bennett, Chief Executive of START Network, and this is our first session of the START Network Annual Assembly 2024. And if you joined me for the opening a few minutes ago, you'll know that this session is about zooming out. To really consider the state of the humanitarian system in which the work of START Network is taking place, and to remind ourselves why our focus on system change is so important, and not as a theory, not as a concept, but actually in real world terms. So here we are at the end of 2024, and the headlines are sobering, but also very familiar. Escalating protracted humanitarian needs, the widest funding gap on record, and calls for humanitarians to do ever more with less. All of this set against a backdrop of relentless, catastrophic climate hazards like the worst floods in decades in eastern Bangladesh and in Nepal just in the last few months. And all of this while witnessing dehumanizing slaughter, destruction, horror in the Middle East, and the worst levels of food insecurity recorded by the IPC in Sudan. All of this while 91% of humanitarian emergencies, quote unquote, are in fact protracted, lasting longer than 5 years. And all of this amidst a reform fatigue that sees aid organizations across the entire system dragging their feet on critical transformational shifts. So this sort of begged us to ask ourselves and to ask all of you, has humanitarianism as a concept and a practice finally reached its limits in a world that demands more from international aid and probably should? Or is this a crisis of our own making? Have we just, as humanitarians, taken on too much? Do we find ourselves perpetually underskilled, perpetually under-resourced, and too easily used as cover for political inaction? And in fact, if that's the case, what should we be doing about any of this? So to help us answer these questions, because I don't think there are necessarily answers to these questions, we've got four practitioners, analysts, and observers in the humanitarian system to help us have this discussion. I'd like to introduce them now. First, we have Uni Krishnan, the Global Humanitarian Director of Plan International. Uni, give a wave. Great, there you are. Next, we have Idris Dar, Executive Director of WASDA in Kenya that works in Somalia. Idris, give us a wave. Meg Sattler, CEO of Ground Truth Solutions. Meg, are you there? Yep, there you are. Give us a wave. And Will Worley, reporter and policy editor for the New Humanitarian. Will, I think you did give us a wave. There we go. Okay, so these are our panelists, and I'm going to start to generate a bit of conversation among them. But rather than have a bit of panel and then a bit of Q&A, I thought we'd just mix it up a little bit. So I'd like to get you, the audience, those of you listening, involved in the discussion from the beginning. So as we're starting to speak, as we're starting to unpack some of these questions, please put your own questions in the chat. And then my colleague Lucy here is sitting next to me, and she'll pass me these questions, and hopefully we'll be able to integrate them into the conversation. So let's see how that all works. We've got like just under an hour. Let's get started. So first, this sort of burning question of how, has humanitarianism as a concept and a practice reached its limits? Why or why not? What do you think? First, let me turn to you, Uni. Get us started.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Christina, and thank you, START Network, for bringing us together. And also thank you for inviting me. Looking at all of you, I can see a good number of people from really different parts of the world, of course, more from the Asia Pacific and some parts of Africa and Europe, dramatically because of the timing reasons, especially the humanitarians, volunteers, frontline workers is quite, I must say, deeply humbling. And each of you here, I believe, is also because of the same reason I'm here. That is, how do we create a world which is much safer, more resilient, able to resist, kinder, and more just for everyone? So today, the question which you posed, Christina, I believe is a question for not just for the panel, but in fact for all of us, and in fact the whole sector. And my short answer is yes, we are in a crisis. But the question that haunts us is, have we adapted enough as humanitarians? Are we evolving fast enough to address the growing complexities of today's world? Or are we clinging on to outdated models that no longer serve those in desperate need? So these are some of the questions. So the crises are no longer isolated, they drag on, they intertwine, and they intensify. Yet our approaches sometimes fall behind. Are we truly listening to those who are on the front lines? I mean, the local agencies and local, relief workers and others. Too often, the answer is no. The START network, I've seen it personally in some of the flood-prone areas in Bangladesh or in Nepal or other places. You offer a different vision forward, localized, anticipatory responses. And I've seen it firsthand how it strengthens the vulnerable communities, and where proactive and community-driven approaches can result in better, innovative, and practical and tailor-made solutions at the very local level, saving lives and reducing suffering. And these models are the future, but major challenges actually block our path. Let me tell on two specific things. Firstly, the funding gap. This year, the world asked for $46 billion for humanitarian aid, but we'll be lucky if we get half of it. But for a perspective, in 2022, $21 billion was spent on chewing gums and bubble gums worldwide. And last year, the global military expenditure was $2 trillion. So it's fake news when we hear there is no money. The question is, where is the money going and what is it being spent on? So one fundamental question is, are we making noise loud enough to change how politicians and policymakers and those who have money prioritize what they want to spend on? And most importantly, when we get money, are we ensuring it is going to the most appropriate people, such as the local agencies and local relief workers? The second challenge is much deeper. It is about values. We are not here merely to deliver aid. We are here to stand for humanity, some of the values such as dignity and the rights of the vulnerable, such as the most vulnerable, such as children, especially the big ideas of human values such as compassion and kindness, also the humanitarian principle. That is absolutely critical, because if we lose them, we lose everything, our purpose, our identity, and our relevance. And today's world demands we go beyond linear checklist approach. 2 weeks ago, I was in Tapachula. This is a border town between Mexico and Guatemala, where I met a mother with 2 young children. She walked for more than 4,000 kilometers through some of the most dangerous regions you can think of, such as the Darien Gap, otherwise grimly known as the Death Valley. And with unimaginable danger, her story echoes the stories of 117 million displaced people worldwide. And they make choices, sometimes born from fear and from violence. And is it enough to offer hygiene kits when they go through the treacherous trip of 4,000 kilometers? These stories are real. They are not distant. As we gather today, we all are familiar with the headlines, the floods in Spain and the unfolding tragedies, preventable tragedies in Sudan and Gaza. Look at Sudan, about 5 million children being displaced, the largest children's displacement in the world, more than the population of entire Ireland. And if you look at Gaza, over the past 13 months, more than 17,000 children have been brutally killed by bombings and missile strikes by the Israeli military. That is 42 children every single day. A full school bus of children disappearing each day in front of our eyes. And this is a grim reality for families there, as well as for the relief workers. So first, most importantly, how do we stop some of this? And most importantly, how do we stop some of this systematic violation of international humanitarian laws and some of the principles? Last question being, can relief workers alone stop a genocide or a climate crisis? Maybe not. Our voices might not end a war or halt brutality, but I believe that our silence makes us complicit in human suffering. Our voices, our actions, no matter small, really matter. So I'm really looking forward to listening to the wealth of expertise we have both on the panel as well as audience, to understand how do we really invent the future of our work. Thank you for listening.
Thanks so much for that, Uni, and for getting us started on this important discussion. I wanted just to maybe pick something up that you said. As a humanitarian director and a longtime, humanitarian worker in this field, you're very linked to the principles, as you should be, as we all have been. And you said just now that it is the principles that really define our purpose and our identity. But at the same time, you've also said things like we need to be listening to local actors. We need to stand for values. And sometimes local actors really can't abide by humanitarian principles, and particularly neutrality, right? Because they are of the community. They're not going to stand they're not going to stand for sort of a neutral way of operating if they see their own communities being damaged by a party to a conflict, for example. So, and then, things like solidarity and kindness and dignity and all of these values that you said we should stand for, they aren't part of our principles. So, how do you square that circle? Are the principles useful, or are they for an era that doesn't exist anymore?
I actually believe very good question, and I'm sure that there will be different reactions coming from also from the audience. But I actually believe that the stronger the hit on communities, the more stronger should be our commitment to principles. And it is important to recognize these principles come from the fundamental values that define humanity, such as kindness, compassion, and human dignity. No one in my, I have ended up in working in, side by side with local relief workers and local agencies, many conflict zones, and also, places hit by floods and others, and also complex emergencies. Nowhere in the world I have seen any community thinking children are our enemies. It is quite clear if you look at Tigray to all range of places. Nowhere I have seen communities saying that those children are our enemies. I've never seen that, honestly. And I will challenge everyone who is, in the audience to tell me any experience they have where a community said, do not support children who are starving on the other side of the border or in other communities. So the fundamental question is, are we prioritizing the most vulnerable, such as children and women or girls in crisis settings? I think that will help us to get better clarity on what these values really mean and how do we practically make these principles work.
Okay, thanks for that, Uni. I might now move to Idris in Kenya. How are you, Idris? Maybe just to pick up on something that Uni said, both on the humanitarian principles, I'd love to hear your views as someone working in a local organization in Kenya for Somalia, whether humanitarian principles would that you would be able to operate on that basis as a local organization. But also, Uni brought up something else around the way that we give money and this funding gap. And the fact that we're asking for 46 billion US dollars this year, and we're not even going to get half of it. And meanwhile, in places like Somalia, most of the crises that you experience are long-term. They're protracted, they're cyclical, they happen every year. You see them come and go. You're very familiar with whether it's droughts or flooding or food insecurity in Somalia, as well as conflict. This happens, this has been happening for years. So maybe my first question to you, well, why don't you say what you wanted to say, but also could you address this question of principles? And could you also address this question of funding and whether it's fit for purpose in a place like Somalia? Idris, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. My name is Idris, that has been introduced. I work for a small organization that works across the Kenya and Somalia, and I have been with that organization for the last 24 years. 2 years before that, I worked with the MSF Belgium. So I've been around the humanitarian sector for 26 years, and a long time, especially if you work in disaster-prone areas like Kenya and Somalia. I do believe we have not reached the limit. We are not yet there, and we will not reach limits if we are serious on humanitarianism, as Uni said. I believe the first thing that we lack is commitment. International actors signed commitments like the Grand Bargain. The first target was 25% of funding to local organizations by year 2020. That was 4 years ago. It never happened. Actually, direct funding to local organizations have moved from 2% when we were in Istanbul in 2016 to about 1.2% globally now. And that is serious reduction when the Grand Bargain signatories had committed to increase that. So we lack commitment to agreement to sign global actors. And then we also are not addressing the causes of displacement and conflict, majorly issues around climate change. It is known, it has been predicted, it's something that can be addressed in advance. There are fundings that are allocated at all these COP meetings. The fundings are not coming. The commitments are not again being met. That is serious lack of humanitarianism. The other thing is, it seems that one thing we lack is globally is the linking humanitarianism from interest, country interest, bilateral interest. This is something that is really biting us. And you'll see that organizations had committed, I mean, countries, donor countries have committed, I think, was it 0.7% or 0. Some percentage to humanitarian work. It's not happening. I think UK was the last that or reduced that officially to, I don't know the amount, the figure right now. That's also another thing. One other thing is we are lacking, we are not disciplined enough, we are not serious enough to invest in anticipatory action and early action. Some of these disasters are predictable. Some of them for a long time, takes a long time to come. If we know that we can save $6 in every dollar we invest in anticipatory action, it's not happening. And it has been the talk for the last 3-4 years. I'm not seeing anything that we can touch on that happening seriously. So if we could invest in early action and also in anticipatory action, that seriousness to funding that is lacking. The other thing that if I come down to where I am, third world countries are not taking their responsibilities to their citizens that seriously. Take Kenya, for example. Kenya classified as itself as a developing country. 4 years ago, it was a political move. So when like the corona, the locust infestation, the drought between 2022 and 20 from 2021 to 2023 April, when that happened, very few donors wanted to invest in Kenya because the world believes that a country like Kenya can stand for itself and address the needs of its people if it's already a developing country. So Kenya no longer receives as much aid as possible, but it remains mentally the same it was 20 years ago. It hasn't shifted with the new level it has gone to as a developing country. One other thing is the issue of I've talked about commitment to the lack of serious commitment we make. I've talked about really us failing to walk the talk in many of these commitments we make. And then on the humanitarian principles, I believe in protracted, especially conflict areas like Somalia, where there are actors other than the government that opposes everything that the government does. It is hard for them, for us to work fully in the lens of the humanitarian principles. Because if you apply humanitarian principle in Somalia, in parts of Somalia, you'll be killed, you'll be banned, you'll be chased. So sometimes you watch as humanitarian principles are trampled on, and there's nothing you can do about it because it's a matter of life and death. I have been, our staff have been taken twice by armed actors in Somalia, called Al-Shabaab. In 2020, they took 4 staff and got released after 3 months. And in 2022, they took 6 staff. All were healthy staff. All were doing mobile health services. This is a core humanitarian need. And we have been talking to the elders who talk with those actors that please allow our staff but sometimes we are told you have crossed into green zones, red zones, and there are no borders visible, and they don't announce where the red zones are. So those are some of the things that are hindering us to respond according to humanitarian principles. Sometimes you don't dare go where you know there are really needs, and you may have some funding to respond to that. You are stopped by the circumstances and the context. So for funding, Uni has already said what's happening. Last year, Somalia received about $2 billion for humanitarian funding, which is, I think, about 35% of the needs that are in the humanitarian response plan. Serious underfunding. And then the disasters, we were in a 3-year drought, continuous drought. In April, when it's rained hell. And floods carried everything worsening the situation. So again, the funding models are not flexible to move people. I mean, to allow us move from one disaster to another smoothly and efficiently and in time. So the restriction about obligatory things we have signed, the things about reporting back to the donor and requesting change, which may take 2-3 months, the thing about reallocation, which again you have to ask for permission. So the humanitarian system is still held back by what we call how do I put it in English, by systems that are not designed for humanitarian action or fast action. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Idris. If I could just keep you on the hook for just a couple of minutes and go back to a couple of things that you've said. So you started out your chat by talking about the commitments, but lack of commitment to our commitments, I suppose, the lack of action to action those commitments. And this whole assembly is about from intention to impact. So the theme is really about how do we move from everything that we say we want to do to actually doing it. And so I wondered if you could just explain why you think we have trouble, actioning our commitments. Is it us? Is it the system? Is it, what is it? Maybe that's my first question back to you.
I think it's all about us in the humanitarian sector, whether we are donors or humanitarian tasks, including the UN, international organization, local organization, other community-based organizations. Our systems, as I said, are still based on non-humanitarian laws and the systems, such that we cannot modify a grant agreement if there's change of context or change of circumstance or change of needs. We are still stuck in a law set in Washington or in London or in Brussels or wherever, or in Germany or in Copenhagen or whatever it happens. So those systems, I think, needs to be reviewed. And we have one way to do is we need to do far lobby at international level, at headquarter level in Washington and in London and in Berlin and all those huge actors, including ECHO and these bilateral organizations. You can't expect. Another time we had asked for a revision because of the cholera outbreak, say that we need this money. We will have used for cash. Can we use part of money for cholera response? And the activities are very clear. It took 2 months. By then there were 13 deaths. A lot of children had suffered. So again, it's about the systems, and we need to lobby. The other one is about taking signatories of um, things like grand bargain to task, to account for their action. We are not doing enough, I think. We are not serious enough. We are not knocking their doors. We are not bombarding them with the image like Avast do when do their campaigns. So I think we need the Avast type campaign so that we move we move things globally in huge numbers. That's the only time we'll be listened to.
Great. Thanks very much, Idris. I'd like to now we'll come back to you on a few of these points, but I'd like to now move to Meg. Meg, you've listened to two panelists now. I'm sure you have your own thoughts on this question, but from where you sit at Ground Truth Solutions, what do you feel, how would you answer the question, has humanitarianism reached its limits?
Thank you so much, Christina, and thanks to all of the panelists for their input, because my head is spinning with thoughts and more questions than answers. It's a huge question, and I'm grateful for the chance to discuss it because I think it's a very pressing question given the pressures that Christina outlined in her introduction. I think we'd be wrong if we said that we weren't partly in a crisis of our own making. And I think that's because these sort of ever-swelling humanitarian budgets don't seem to be meeting needs or addressing root causes. It's not like across the board we're doing this perfect work and the biggest problem is that there's not enough money to scale it up. And I think that's really sobering but really important to remember. The way that we're doing aid, and we have, a lot of evidence from GTS to back this up, is clunky and expensive, and a large part of it is sort of behaving like a Band-Aid factory in a world of gaping wounds, and at some point we're going to run out of Band-Aids. And we know that there's so much money wasted on bureaucracy, on kind of repeating ways of working from quite a dated playbook. And, many of the issues that START has tried to shake up through its different ways of working are some of the ones that I'm talking about. But I think based on my very limited sphere of analysis and influence, there are kind of two main questions here. And I think one is, can we and how do we do aid better? And by better, I guess I mean more in line with the priorities of those that it's intended to benefit. And two is the bigger question that Uni described quite passionately, which is how does that fit into a broader need for reform of kind of global cooperation? If we accept that we're all kind of going to hell in a handbasket, which is what it feels like, we need a combination of stronger local communities and more appropriate global support for global problems. So the first part of that is kind of easier. If you think about the fact that, crises are getting worse, we're going to need more aid. Aid just needs to be done better. And I think making it better shouldn't actually be as hard as we make it. I think to a large degree, it's just doing all the things that we've made endless commitments to do and patted each other on the back for and had group photos about and then not done them. Like all the stuff from the Grand Bargain about radically increasing funding to local organisations, making sure that cash keeps scaling up and doesn't plateau, actually putting people at the centre of decision making, being more accountable. Idris is right that there is no accountability for all of those commitments, which I think is why so much of this has stalled. And that's really sad, because something, Christina, that we were saying the other day is that, like, if a lot of these reforms had been able to sort of scale, we would have more evidence about better ways of doing things that we still don't really have at the scale that is required. And I think that's why this whole like putting people at the center thing needs to stop being a sort of random theoretical statement. And if you look at data from Ukraine, which is a response where there's been more money and the focus sort of seems to have been more placed on dignity than survival in many ways, a lot of the evidence does actually seem to paint a brighter picture than in a lot of other places. Not perfect by any stretch, but better in many ways. So I think it's important to remember, even before we get more ambitious and think bigger, that aid is not so broken that it can't be improved a lot already, I think, today. The second question is the harder one, the bigger thing that doesn't feature in enough conversations about humanitarian aid is that no one wants humanitarian aid. Absolutely no one. You know, if we start with people's feedback on aid, they always say two things. You know, the first one is address the root causes. We don't want humanitarian assistance. We don't want to be humiliated like this. We don't want to be in this situation. We just hosted quite a remarkable discussion on Gaza and Lebanon with local responders. And of course, for local responders, it's completely impossible to separate aid from justice and rights and foreign intervention in all three of those things. And it's the same whether it's conflict or climate change or politics. Can we resolve those issues? No. But there's still, I guess, a second part of it, which is the middle ground, which is more sustainable and sort of dignified approaches to assistance, and at the very least, more of a focus on resilience. On this panel, we had a brilliant woman from Lebanon who said, you know, we really need to stop focusing on this like idea of the individual and focus more on strengthening institutions and community agency. If we sort of trust that people know what they need in crisis and it isn't humanitarian aid, but it's something else, how can you sort of work with other people to reorganize so that they might be able to get those things? Because it feels like we're on a bit of a precipice. And there's this whole thing about how we have no money and everyone's sort of doubling down on what is humanitarianism and how do we ring fence it. I think the real risk is that humanitarians double down and ring fence completely unsustainable activities under the guise of words like life-saving, but also have to do those activities in more places and say that the longer term stuff is someone else's problem. But in many places, the issue is that someone else is nowhere to be found. So there kind of needs to be more discussions about who else can fill that gap. I think it's quite amazing that humanitarianism is still discussed in such a vacuum. And I am as guilty of that as anyone, actually. If I look back at everything I've said over the past 10 years, I often don't recognize any worlds outside those of humanitarianism. But I think in terms of who has really inspired me to stop doing that, it's largely students who get out every Sunday and protest for a ceasefire. I found it so interesting that the general public is applying so much scrutiny right now to the role of global systems and global cooperation because of Gaza. Joe Public is not asking about aid effectiveness in a vacuum. They're asking, how is it possibly rational that states are providing weapons with one hand and aid with the other? And what is the role of the United Nations? You know, it's kind of astounding how siloed the humanitarian discussion still is. Like, to, I think, a lot of people outside this world, that feels a bit delusional. So I agree with Uni that it's kind of nonsense that there's no money. You know, there's money that is spent every day on super yachts and destroying the earth and weapons that kill children and all sorts of other things. And I do worry, I guess, that principles see us pretend or sort of be able to pretend that aid exists in this exceptional world and then start to believe it, which probably does serve to perpetuate some norms that should probably be unacceptable. So I don't know if I'm proposing some kind of global utopia where that's not an issue or where community needs are always supported by some amazing global system. I wish I could. I don't think I am, but I think we should aspire to learning a bit more about what goes on, you know, across the fence from humanitarian action and seeing where we can make a few more of those connections, I guess, at a minimum. But beyond that, I think I'm finding this question really hard to unpack because it's such a complex one.
Yeah, no, it is. And thank you. You've given us a lot more food for thought. It gets even bigger, the question, as this panel goes on. You've raised a lot of really, really big things. I'm going to just ask one back to you. What I think you're talking about in sort of getting out of this preciousness of humanitarian exclusion or humanitarian exceptionalism that keeps us in this very bordered existence as a humanitarian sector without looking outside to see where we need to be having broader discussions. To me, and you know, based on where you do sit, this is a question of accountability. Because if we thought a little bit about the problems we were trying to solve and who will benefit from those solutions, I think our accountability will be elsewhere. As you said, we put people at the center. People's problems aren't necessarily humanitarian or political. There are a whole host of things all happening at the same time. So, you know, if this part of this is an accountability problem, where is that accountability solution or a potential new way of thinking about how we hold ourselves to account, not just for the emergency life-saving aid that we provide, but for the overall well-being, I suppose, that we're all talking about of communities caught in crisis. What are some ideas? I know you won't have solutions per se, but what are some ideas around accountability that we can think about?
Yeah, it's such a big question. And I know that a couple of the other panelists have touched on this a little bit as well. I mean, I think, a very ground truthy answer is obviously going to be that our accountability is very misplaced. So everyone is still very accountable to, their various funding sources and the funding sources allegedly to their taxpayers. There's not really a lot of accountability to the people who are supposed to stand to benefit from all of these different programs. The solutions to that, I think, as we've all, as various people with different vantage points on this panel have seen, is very hard because of this incentives and sanctions gap. So it's our approach to trying to contribute something small to do that is to just kind of listen to people and try and capture their perspectives and produce them in a transparent way. What we found really hard is getting anyone to take that seriously enough to do anything very serious about it, because we're still operating within a system where that accountability sort of structure is facing quite far away from people affected by crisis and not sort of structured within those communities. I think because of this exceptionalism idea, humanitarian action is sort of allowed to function without accountability, because at the community level, from a lot of the discussions we have, we're always looking for, in this community where aid is happening, what are structures that would sort of promote accountability outside the humanitarian system, be they, local legal structures or the role of the media or different sort of traditional approaches to accountability. And I think even to a lot of those communities where aid is so prevalent, the whole aid system is so opaque to people that they find it very hard to hold those systems accountable, even within their own community. And there's also sort of this power differential where people feel like this is, money that is coming from somewhere else that our community needs. So who are we to sort of try and hold it accountable or to, tell it how it should be behaving? So I think whenever there's aid programs, I think this whole, like the role of the students who are protesting for a ceasefire, I think people need to look for what are the opportunities in country where aid is sort of intersecting with people's communities and their lives. Who has an inherent interest in holding these systems accountable, and how can they be supported? How can they be supported to sort of hold more power in that process? And maybe that's a mass education thing. It's also, I think, a mass education thing for taxpayers, because there seems to be this implied assumption that taxpayers wouldn't really be ready for a lot of aid programs that put people at the center of aid, and I don't really believe that anymore. So I think lifting the veil a little bit and opening up aid to have more people involved in it, but also just better engaging with and respecting local systems of accountability would be quite a good start. But there certainly haven't been a lot of great examples of that I can recall off the bat. Great, thanks, Meg. Yeah, again, more questions and answers in all of this, but thanks for giving us that kind of, I don't know, so you're thinking on how accountability needs to be opened up, and this whole system of ours made to be more accessible to people who can hold or taxpayers who can hold their funders to account, but also that can hold us to account for what we do. So Will, I'm going to sort of look at you now. The themes that are sort of coming out of this discussion so far and the questions that are coming in from participants are sort of falling along two lines. So Will, I'll let you kind of say what you wanted to say in reflection to everything that's been said, but also maybe pose two questions to you before you speak that you can maybe think about. Which is, so one line of questioning that we've all been talking about, and there's coming from the audience, is around politicization and the linking, the forever linking of politics and humanitarian aid. And, Idris called for that delinking. Uni talked about, the governments, not being able to
commit to what they say they're going to commit to. We've had a question or a comment from Dennis King in the audience around misinformation and the kind of use of misinformation to further instrumentalize our work. So I guess the question is really like, we all want to delink politics from aid, right? Because they've got different incentives and different outcomes. But I mean, are we naive to think that that will ever happen? And if that naivete is worth thinking about, are there sort of not humanitarian solutions to this depoliticization, or should we be really thinking of ourselves more as political actors? That's the first question. And then second line of questioning seems to be about the expansion of the humanitarian remit. Because of climate, because of the need to, look at communities more holistically, because of the need to, there's been a few questions around longer term resilience. And we heard from Idris about protracted crises. This is all kind of putting pressure on us. So should we really be rethinking where we are as a sector and not limiting ourselves to this very narrow box that Meg was also talking about, that we need to open ourselves up to a more expansive view of what we do and look like outside of ourselves to find those solutions, not necessarily wait for other people to find those solutions, but to look outside of ourselves. So, Will, I don't know, what is your thinking? Look, this is a very, very wide ranging discussion, but how are you taking this, and what are your thoughts?
Well, thanks for such a nice, simple question to start off with.
Yeah, I thought I'd give that to you, but you can handle it, Will.
No, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for having me. It's difficult to Meg touched on a bunch of things that I've been thinking about and reflecting on. And she's gonna be a hard act to follow, I think. So if I can formulate myself half as well as her, I will be happy. I should clarify for everyone that I am a reporter. I am editor and journalist for policy at the New Humanitarian, which is a non-profit news outlet focused on, broadly speaking, the global humanitarian sector, the aid sector. We cover a lot of UN issues. Hopefully you're familiar with some of our work. Do check us out. And I should clarify also, that means I'm basically more of an observer than a practitioner. So I haven't run aid programs or anything like that. But I think the observer status is useful. I've never worked in an NGO, so I don't think I could be said to be suffering from the humanitarian exceptionalism comment, which sort of came up earlier, which I think is helpful for a journalist. So to your first kind of point, so there's three different questions to answer. So maybe in the interest of time, we can come back to the reflections on where the humanitarian limits are later in a bit. What's really jumped out to me throughout this whole sort of conversation is this kind of link to politics and where the global political conversation is kind of at. I think it's obviously a really important week for politics. What happens in the US tomorrow, we'll find out on Thursday, is going to be really key. No one, I don't think, is holding out a huge amount of optimism around kind of the US restraining Israel anytime soon, but there are other aspects of the US that are important to this conversation. Staying in the Paris Agreement and taking part in climate negotiations is an important one. Some predictability kind of around aid flows. The politics has a key link in that the donor funding, which has been talked about, and the kind of the restrictions on funding, the hesitations around giving more autonomy to grassroots groups is a really key one. The lack of support for international humanitarian law, and more broadly, this sort of lack of boldness and sort of courage to do more problem solving in international affairs. You look to the situation in Israel, Gaza, and Lebanon, and there's been no sort of real creativity. There's been no courage there to try and resolve the situation. This also kind of links to quite a stagnant or difficult domestic politics in many donor countries. the UK aid budget was mentioned earlier. I covered the UK aid budget for several years in depth. I covered the cuts. I'm going to make a prediction now, actually, that the UK aid budget will never recover back to 0.7% this decade unless something changes very unexpectedly. But partly that is because of the a bit of a reflection of where the domestic politics is at in the UK. There's a lot of caution. There's a lot of distrust of internationalism, international cooperation in among some kind of sectors of the public. Climate in particular is being used as a kind of a wedge issue to create polarization, in voters. So it's a really difficult political landscape within the donor countries that are being that I'm talking about. I know there's a hesitation among humanitarians to be kind of so focused on the global north at times, but there's so much need also for kind of grant funding and concessional funding, and ultimately that does come mostly from a small kind of number of countries. I guess the politics is also where the kind of the more optimistic links can be kind of found. I mean, if we sort of look again to the climate space, I'm going to Baku next week, so I've been wearing my climate hat quite a bit recently. You've got interesting sort of politicians like Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados. She's just taken the chair of the Vulnerable 20 group of climate countries. She's been quite explicitly making a link between climate justice, climate finance, and reparations for slavery, and that's something which really came out in the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting quite recently. It caught the UK government, I think, quite on the back foot. But the fact that such a topic that was previously so sort of taboo and nowhere to be heard of in the international sphere, I think is quite an interesting sign of the times, how fast that's kind of come to leading the agenda. And I think is a bit of an indication of how fast things are moving. So in terms of delinking politics and aid, I don't think it's naive. I think it's to think that will happen. But I think the politics is going to be completely unrecognizable and is already changing very fast before us. And humanitarians need to kind of take that into account. I think particularly when engaging with other sectors like climate, as is ever more needed, and that is where a lot of the momentum and financing is, quite frankly, at the moment.
Great, thanks, Will. So I guess what I'm hearing, and of course we're like monitoring the questions coming in, and Will, you sort of come down firmly on this, that look, we need to be looking beyond life-saving. It's just not enough to be, you said you haven't felt the exclusion of that NGOs might have felt, but yet you're talking about all of these problems like climate justice and these kind of bigger issues that humanitarians don't traditionally engage in. We've had a question here, even in the from the audience, around, I think referring possibly to Hugo Slim's article, around the fact that humanitarianism can't even just be for humans only, that we need to be thinking of our positioning in an environment and an ecosystem that includes the earth and nature. And so that's an even bigger remit, that we can't even just look after humans, that we now have to look after humans in the context of our environment. So basically, there's an overall feeling coming through that we need to be doing more, that humanitarianism can't really exist in the silo that it has been for years yet. Will, you're saying, like, your prediction is that the UK, probably the only government that was managed to ever reach 0.7% of GDP for aid funding, has now stripped back that goal, probably will never get there again. So, square this circle for me. Like, if we're gonna, where is the political momentum going to come from? Where's the money going to come from? If we have to look beyond our ourselves and get over ourselves, really, and our principles and our narrow way of working to really solve the problems that the world needs from us right now.
If you're asking a journalist to square the circle for you, Christina, I'm afraid barking up the wrong tree.
Any thought on that? And then I'll ask others, other panelists, to just come in on that one. And then I'll ask a final question before we end.
Yeah, sure. I mean, something that Hugo Slim was telling me about, this idea that he had of expanding the humanitarian mandate to a sort of planetary mandate, and the first kind of reaction I had was, wow, good luck with that. These institutions are so entrenched and kind of culturally very much used to their own way of sort of doing things. And then the second thought I kind of had was, this isn't actually such a different idea from a lot of kind of indigenous ideas about existing kind of at one with their environment, which is again, looking at the kind of the climate side of things, it's quite a strong a theme that sort of comes through. I think that whether it's out of sort of a need or just because where funding flows are going, that there is a growing engagement between humanitarians and the climate sector, albeit kind of late. I think humanitarians are broadly viewed sort of quietly and politely within the climate space as sort of piggybacking on a lot of the successes and hard-fought victories that they've made over the last kind of couple of decades. But I think that approaching climate with humility is probably quite an important way to go about doing things, rather than just sort of eyeing a piggy bank. I keep coming back to sort of climate because there are sort of other initiatives sort of going on that does signal, I guess, a bit of optimism, albeit hugely caveated about where political momentum is and where money is coming from. On the money, there is a lot of discussions linked to climate, about various taxes, carbon levies, that sort of thing. And that will be linking those to various climate needs. They're overlapping now with humanitarian needs. Adaptation is sort of widely accepted by everybody within the climate discussions. Loss and damage, despite the agreement, is still more contentious, where there is an agreement to get dedicated funding for loss and damage in this year's big new climate finance target called the NCQG. That kind of remains to be seen. But what's interesting with the climate space is how much of this is driven by sort of so-called global South actors. They call themselves the least developed countries. The small island states have been driving a lot of momentum for some like the most interesting innovations within I think the last decade, in which humanitarians kind of very excited. Now there's all sorts of kind of gaps and works to be done. But that's why these policy areas are so interesting to me as someone who covers humanitarianism more broadly.
Great. Thanks very much, Will. All right, I want to go back, Uni, I'm going to go back to you now and then ask each of our panelists for sort of a last round of thoughts. Uni, anything that you have taken away from this discussion, and particularly around the fact that I think what we're saying is, as traditionally defined, humanitarianism has reached its limits. It needs to find a new purpose. Any thoughts on that? And then really, because we are a network of civil society organizations, and because one of our members, Sami Hamidi from OSED in Afghanistan, has asked, what do you see as the role of CBOs, of civil society, playing in reshaping this humanitarian system that we are saying has reached its limits in terms of its traditional ways of operating? Uni, do you want to get us started on that? And I'll go in the same order as before.
Thank you, Christina. And in fact, I'm very much tempted to post a question to the audience, which I will do with your permission in 15 seconds. But firstly, the comment about I'm really looking at a range of people who are here, and especially from some of the hotspots and other places. I'm really don't want to miss the opportunity of listening to them on a burning question, which I've been facing recent days, which I'm going to post now into the box. But at the same time, the point about the local the CBOs. I actually think with all range of issues, including the proliferation of fake news and a range of things, and the reality getting blurred, it becomes even more important why those closer to the point of impact should be at the heart of our thinking and actions. At the same time, during this panel and also in other conversations, especially on this panel, it has come out very clearly the high levels of unmet needs and growing number of crisis and also polycrisis, and also because of conflicts and climates and all range of things, and the importance of, if there is less money and more people to be protected, it makes common sense to prioritize the most vulnerable. As someone who works with and for children as Plan International, we are absolutely keen that we start seeing and encourage everyone to start looking at the crisis through the eyes of children. That is, looking, learning, and start responding to the crisis by looking at through the eyes of the children. This basically means three things. First of all, protection of children. Stop bombing children. That's not too much to ask for. The issue of, the principles will come here, but the whole idea of asking, anyone to stop bombing children and stop bombing schools should not be controversial. This is a simple truth. It should never sound revolutionary. Something very basic and simple. If it sounds revolutionary, that is, stop asking, I mean to say that stop bombing schools and, children, that must be something absolutely unacceptable going on. So that's the first thing. Protection, stop recruitment in armed groups, and most importantly, recognizing some of the invisible needs and sometimes that we miss, such as emotional care and support. And I would say, finally, it's not just about today, but also recognizing these children have a long way to go, so that protected future, most importantly, from the climate and the conflict, really matters.
Thanks very much, Puneet. So what CBOs can do, what civil society can do, is really stand for our principles in places like, or in the areas of people like children, because we are the ones that can help protect them. Okay, Idris, what are your thoughts on, this discussion on humanitarianism having reached its limits, and therefore, what is the role of civil society and organizations such as yours in reshaping humanitarianism?
First of all, I sit in the humanitarian country team that's chaired by the humanitarian coordinator in Somalia. And this drive to have system changes, not only us. The UN is thinking of remodeling, rethinking about the cluster system. The humanitarian coordinator for Somalia said that this system has been in place for 20 years, the cluster system, and it's not functioning. There's need to change. So the thinking is also, the good thing is with the UN, and it wants to rethink about how to operate humanitarian, in response to humanitarianism. That's one thing. The other thing is that in a world where funds management, capacity, risk aversity is so huge, I find it very difficult for us to be able to work with the local organizations, because one of the requirements for SAT network membership was, do we have any, which we failed in my organization did not have, is that whether we have any way to engage with sub lower implementers like community-based organizations. We said we don't have. And again, that is a structural thing. It's, if it becomes a requirement, it becomes a blocker. So there are these things that we need to undo. These things that have been held tightly through regulations, through statutory requirements, through reporting, through meeting, ticking boxes for meeting. Then also about risks, aversity, and how
Great.
much do we want to take risk as humanitarian actors.
Thank you, Idris. I have to move to our final two panelists because we have 2 minutes. So Meg in 1 minute and then Will in 1 minute. Can you just sort of close with your final reflections about and what civil society can do? Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I really like this question about civil society because also, this is a START network discussion, and I know that the START network has this whole network of wonderfully diverse actors. And for many of them, most of them, I would say humanitarianism is not some kind of weird global career. It's a side project of a broader goal of sustainable improvements in their communities. And so to me, I think the civil society question is one of the biggest ones, because these local civil society organizations, these silos don't exist in these organizations. And so the amplification of those views is really critical. I think there's a bit of I mean, it is a problem, but it's also a huge opportunity. I think the separation between those actors and organizations and systems of global support and solidarity is ripe for innovation. And many ways to do that don't require big, clunky global reforms. Like actually, Lucy at Start and I are both on the advisory board for a small organization which sort of tries to connect Danish civil society with civil society in a lot of other countries affected by crisis. And I think that's a really interesting model. Like there's so many things I
Meg,
think
I
that
just
can
want to,
happen.
we're going to actually get cut off in a second because the system is going to cut us off. The
I'll
system is going to
stop
cut us
there,
off.
but that's the
So
general
stop
idea I'm
there.
trying to get across.
Will, do you have like one sentence? I'm really sorry to cut you off, but we are going to get cut off by the
Civil
tech.
society groups are already doing an amazing job under difficult circumstances, and it's incumbent upon the rest of us to facilitate that and help that work improve more.
Wonderful. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to our 100 people that have been listening to this call. I hope it's been a really interesting discussion. There's a lot of chatter going on in the chat, so hopefully this has been recorded and we can preserve the chat for future thinking. But thanks to all of our panelists for having this discussion with us this morning, and thanks to the rest of you for listening. The Start Network Assembly is always a fantastic place to have these discussions, so I really appreciate it. Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of these 2 days. Bye.
Thank you.